Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. One of my goals in making these videos for YouTube was to cover pretty much all of my improvement issues and ideas that I covered in my ICC videos and in my Novice Nook column, which was basically a column about getting better at chess for all levels. And one of the columns that I wrote that won an honorable mention award for best instruction, I did not really have a video on that, so I thought it'd be a good idea to do one today. And that idea is called filters and masks. So filters and masks in chess are going to mean a little bit similar to what they mean in English, and especially what a filter means in mathematics, in programming. A mask is going to be something which covers something up, not the kind of mask that you would wear for COVID or anything like that. But a mask is something that masks something else in chess. Masks an idea, masks a problem, masks something. A filter is something that someone applies to an issue or a question or an idea that filters things out that may or may not be good to filter, that may or may not be good to eliminate. You don't want to filter them out. So sometimes people make mask issues or they make filtering problems. So I thought I'd come up with a few examples of each because these ideas come up quite often. Probably the most common type of idea I see for masks is what happens when somebody plays too fast or too slow. When they play too fast or too slow, it tends to mask other problems because you really don't know what they would do if they had the right amount of time or they could try the right amount, because they don't. So you don't know what they really know. Now, for instance, playing too fast will not mask your problems in your book openings because you can play the book openings really quickly. But suppose you play way too fast and there's a complicated position and you continue to play those positions really poorly, well, that masks whether or not you really could play those problems right if you took your time. A more common example that I run into a lot when I'm teaching is what happens to people who play too slow when they get to the end game. And a lot of people who play too slow say to me, I'm not very good at the end game, I blow a lot of end games, and so on. And my comment is always the same, which is, well, okay, but maybe you're not that bad at end games. Maybe you are, but I don't know. Your problem is being masked because when you play too slow and you get to the end game, you don't have enough time left to play the end game, and that masks what's happening in the end game. So I don't really know how to help you until you try to play end games where you have more time, and then we can see what you're actually doing with your time. And if you're still making mistakes and having problems because you are misunderstanding something or you can't analyze, or because you analyze poorly, or you have visualization problems, well, those we can see. But if you play a game where you have 30 minutes for the whole game and you take 28 minutes for the first 15 moves and you only have 2 minutes to play the rest of the game, then that's going to mask all the other problems that you might have had if you had been playing at a reasonable rate. So in that sense, mask means it does cover up things. It masks the problems. One of the things you often see is that people who are afraid of tactics or they try to avoid tactics, they play openings that mask their tactical problems. They try to get into openings that are less tactical. Well, that makes sense if you're trying to win the World Open. If you're trying to get $10,000, in every game you want to play the best you can. And I had an earlier video where I talked about the difference between maximizing your improvement and maximizing your score. So if you're playing at the World Open, you're always trying to maximize your score. So you're trying to mask your weaknesses and magnify your strengths. It just makes sense to do that. So you want to play openings that exactly take you where you want to go. But if you're not a very good player and you're trying to improve, then playing those exact same things that mask your problems is actually just putting off your improvement in those areas, and that's something you probably don't want to do. So for instance, let's take a look at the King's Indian attack. A lot of people like to play the King's Indian attack. These days it's not as popular because people have switched to the London. But they play the King's Indian attack or the London, and their idea is that those are systems they can play. They don't have to learn a whole bunch of different lines, and they're also fairly innocuous. There's not a lot of traps in those openings. So they say, all right, well, I'm not very good at tactics, so I'm just going to play a King's Indian attack. And I'm going to play these moves no matter what he plays, and I'm going to play d3. And if he plays knight f6, I like to play knight bd2, and on bishop e7, I like to play e4. And that's my, that's my system. And they like to do that, and the reason they like to do that is, I can't go wrong. I've just played the first 7 moves. I can play those, even if black doesn't play those exact moves, if he just plays something vaguely similar, I could probably play those pretty much same moves against black, and I really don't have to learn a lot of openings, and I can mask any lack of information I have with white in playing those openings, and I can also mask my deficiencies in tactics. Well, if it's the World Open and you're trying to win $10,000, maybe that helps a little, but is it likely that a position like this is going to lead to a middle game which has a lot less complications? And the answer is no, not really, because you still have all the pieces on the board, and even though you've delayed a little bit getting into where the two sides are in conflict with each other, you haven't really prevented it. Now, there are some openings that are pretty dull. I mean, for instance, if you want to trade queens and get the queens off the board, you could play this opening, which I know a player in Philadelphia used to play. He used to play d6 and then e5. And now the book move here, and the move that most grandmasters play and most strong players, is knight f3 going into the Philidors, but most weaker players think, oh my goodness, I could trade queens here and stop him from castling. So they play pawn takes, queen takes, king takes, which of course is okay for white, but it doesn't promise white much of an advantage. Black's just going to tuck his king into the c7 square after playing c6, and white's advantage is going to be rather minimal. Let's ask Stockfish here. Stockfish 14, if white trades queens here and stops black from castling, what kind of advantage does he have? Is it a big advantage? And Stockfish is like, oh, he's got a maybe slightly bigger than normal advantage. And usually people play knight f3 here, which is probably a little bit inaccurate. Yeah, see how his advantage drops after knight f3? Black can play f6. Well, that's the kind of move you never play, early in the game with the queens on the board where your king can get into trouble on the light squares. But here, f6 is perfectly good, and white's advantage has dropped to about 0.1. So the engine actually wants to play bishop to c4 instead, and to attack that pawn. And now if he plays knight f6, in fact, now he's thinking about playing the break move f4 instead of putting the knight in front of the pawn here. But, most people aren't going to find ideas like that, and white's going to end up with not much of an advantage at all. And this position does mask a lot of the really strong tactical play, because even though there's a lot of pieces on the board, without the queens, of course, some of the more complicated middle games are more likely avoided. And with the open d file, very likely you're going to trade the rooks in this position. And when you trade the rooks, then the only things that are left then are the minor pieces, and much less likely to get really complicated positions. And there's some openings that do that. For instance, if you don't like to play against the French and you just like kind of even positions, you can mask kind of playing the more interesting aggressive lines like knight to c3. I'll make the board back to regular size. You can just say, all right, I know this bishop's a problem in the French, but I'm not going to take advantage of that. I'll just trade and get rid of my space advantage. And now later on we'll both castle, let's say we both castle kingside. There's a nice line where black doesn't castle kingside, he castles queenside. But then a lot of times the rooks get traded here. And if you have tactical problems, then, I'll just put the rook on e1 right away, even though that's not the main move. And you can end up trading a lot of rooks, and there's an open file. And you don't have to worry again about imbalanced pawn structures. Here the pawn structure is symmetric, kind of boring. And you could say, all right, well, I'm avoiding those imbalanced kind of positions where I don't know how to play very well. All right, so those are masks. A little bit more interesting, I think, are filters. Filters are things that people think about that kind of change how they look at a position, and they change their answers because they filter out what they think that you don't want to hear. So I'm going to show you a position that I've given to many, many students. Let's bring it up here in a second. It's number 30 in my library, I think. EX% 30. Okay. Whoops. I think it's PTLib 230. All right, let me pause it for a second and I'll bring it up. Okay, so here's the position that I sometimes give people. And I ask them a couple questions. The first question I ask them is if Dan Heisman was playing white here and he's making a list of candidate moves, what would be the first move I would put on the list? And I tell people, if you think about it too long, then you're probably going to get it wrong. If you just come up with the first idea off the top of your head, then there's a better chance you'll probably get it right. And that's happened over the years, that people who think about it almost always get the problem wrong. And one of the it's not a problem, it's just a question about how I think. One of the common answers I get when people think for a while is they want to play the AWL C4. Well, C4 is a very good candidate move. Anytime you have an AWL and you're driving a knight out of the middle, it's a very good candidate move. But it wouldn't be the first move on my list. And I'm not asking what's the best move. I'm only asking what's the first move on my list. So they're trying to filter out ideas rather than just list things that might be possible. And it turns out the first thing that I would think of to play here, to put on my list, and it doesn't mean it's a good move, it's the first move on my list, is I have all my pieces here on the back rank and I need to get them out. I want to get knights before bishops. I want to get my pieces toward the middle. So the answer is knight c3. And when I ask people, why didn't you say knight c3? And they say, well, if he takes your knight, that'll double the pawns. Okay, well, that's true, but that's an example of them filtering the question, because I didn't ask them what's a good move or what was the move I would play or anything like that. I'm just saying, if I made a list, what would be the first move on my list? And the answer is, well, I'm going to bring out the knight toward the middle. I'm going to look at knight c3. That doesn't make it a good move, but they filter because they're trying to filter into good moves, and I'm just trying to filter into possible moves that I want to investigate, which is a little bit different. Now, a bigger example of a filter comes later, where I say, all right, let's say someone plays knight c3 here, and we're going to talk about loose pieces. John Nunn has the famous John Nunn dictum that he made up several years ago called LPDO, loose pieces drop off. And a definition of a loose piece is an unguarded piece except for a king. And there's a caveat on that too, and the caveat is especially pieces that are somewhat exposed to attack. For instance, at the start of the game, if I said to you, list all the undefended pieces on the board, the answer would be that the four rooks are the only undefended pieces. So here, these rooks are undefended. But are they loose? Well, sure, we don't have any official dictionary of chess, so you could say they're loose, but they're not very much subject to attack, so thinking of the rooks as being kind of loose is against the general idea of a loose piece. Now, let's say both sides start to fianchetto some bishops. Well, now the rook's on the same line with the bishops, and yeah, we could start to think, oh, maybe the fact that those rooks aren't guarded or they're worth less than bishops is starting to become more of an issue now. Okay, so the idea of looseness in this position for the rooks starts to rise a little bit. Let's go back to the position that we had from the original puzzle with knight c3. So here I ask people, what are all the undefended pieces? Well, when you ask what the undefended pieces are, then you're simply asking undefended. And here they definitely filter out the king. Why? Because you don't need to defend a king. Nobody's going to capture a king and you don't have to recapture it. So the idea of defending a king by actually having a piece that can recapture on that square is, irrelevant. So that's why the king isn't a loose piece. But if you change and you just use the English definition of undefended, then you don't want to filter the king out because the king is undefended. There is no piece that guards the king in this position. But yet people filter that out. And when I say, what are the undefended pieces, they assume I don't mean the king, but I just want them to be able to see that the king is not defended, even though defending a king doesn't really mean anything. And when I ask, the stronger the player that I ask this question, the more likely they get it right. Weaker players kind of argue with me and say, I'm not going to answer that the king is undefended because that doesn't make any sense. Strong players, for the most part, just go, all right, well, the king's not defended, but is that what you mean too? And I go, yeah, and they go, okay, fine, it's on the list. So weaker players have a tendency to do this. They have a tendency to filter, which is also one of the reasons why they make quiescence errors. And quiescence errors is one of the biggest errors that people make. The main reason people make quiescence errors is because instead of asking, if I make this sacrifice, if I play rook takes knight and he takes my rook, instead of saying, well, I lose a rook for a knight, that's no good, I can't do it, good players ask themselves, if I give up the rook for the knight, are there any further checks, captures, or threats that make it worth my while to investigate that maybe would change the evaluation of the position? So therefore, they don't make a quiescence error. But people also make quiescence errors because they filter. They filter out that rook takes knight. They filter out moves that don't look right, when in fact, a lot of moves that don't look right, especially in the endgame, could actually be very strong moves. But they filter it out very quickly. And of course, people who play too fast do that to a great deal of a great extent. Okay, so in this position, besides the king, what are the other undefended pieces which we could call loose pieces? Well, the answer is the pawn on d4 is undefended, the pawn on c2 is undefended, and the rook on a1 is undefended. We're only talking about the white undefended pieces. So then I ask people, all right, can you name all the black moves that attack at least two of those three loose pieces? Again, we're only talking about, let's uncircle the king here. We're only talking about these three now. The rook on a1, the pawn on c2, and the pawn on d4. So I say, name all the black moves that attack at least two of those three. And I'm looking for either there's 0 of them, and a lot of times people filter out the answer 0, but there's either none of them, or there's 1, or there's 2, or there's 3, and if they are, what are they? Well, a lot of times people filter out and they don't get the answer. And then I say to them, all right, let's take the extraneous pieces off the board. And then I do something like this. I take the pieces off the board, the ones that we're not looking at. We're looking at the white ones here. And we'll take him off, we'll take him off, we'll take him off, we'll take him off, and we'll take him off. Okay. Now we have basically the same question because none of the black pieces are really going to be affected by me taking those off in the sense that it doesn't answer the question. Now if I say what are all the moves that attack at least two of those three, now people get it right pretty quickly. The answer is black can play knight b4, which creates a discovered attack on d4 and a direct attack on c2. And by the way, by most nomenclature, this is not a double attack. A double attack is when you move one piece and it hits two or more pieces. If you move a piece and another piece is making one attack and this piece is also making an attack, you could call that a double attack, but that's normally not where people put it in this section on tactics books about double attack. They would tend to more think of this as being a double threat. So like if you buy the Bain book, he has a chapter on double attacks, but he also has another chapter on double threats. So this would more likely be a double threat. Now, obviously, if one of these wasn't an attack, let's say knight c2 was checkmate instead of capturing a pawn, then that's clearly going to be a double threat. You're threatening checkmate and you're threatening to take the pawn. But even in this case, we tend to call this a double threat. So knight b4 is an answer, but there's another move that's very similar to knight b4, and that's knight e3. And again, you're attacking these two. So that's the answer. Those are the two moves that do that. Now let's put the position back up. Examine lib 2% 30. Okay. And we'll go forward. Okay, so when I say what are all the black moves that attack at least two of those three loose pieces, the answer is knight b4 and knight e3. But again, lower rated players, not so much higher rated players, they tend to think that I don't want them to say knight e3 because knight e3 is a dumb move. You're putting your knight where a pawn could take it. You're putting the knight where the bishop could take it, so it's just a terrible bad move. But I didn't ask for what are all the good reasonable moves that attack c2 and d4 or even the rook on a1. I just asked for all the moves. So they filter out knight e3. Well, in this case, that filter would work pretty well because in a real game, knight e3 is not a very good move, but it's also filters out the right answer to the question. And we don't want to filter out the right answer to the question. We want to get the question right. So knight b4 and knight e3. And then I say to people, all right, well, if knight b4 and knight e3 are the moves that attack those pieces, which one would you be more worried about? And then they all say, well, of course, knight b4. If I was white, I wouldn't be worried about knight e3. And I say, well, that's absolutely correct. But knight e3 does attack two of the three, and that's all we're looking for by the question, what's the moves that attack at least two of those three loose pieces? All right, let's look at another filtering example. Let's bring up number 50. I think it's in the first library. Okay, hold on, I'll pause. All right, so this position is an interesting position that I stole from another instructor because somebody came up with this position and I thought it was kind of neat. And the question is, what should you play here as white? And it's one of those instructive puzzles that has a certain point to it. But usually if people have a little trouble with the puzzles, one of the things I ask them is, how many legal checks does white have in this position? Now, if you ask such a question to someone rated over 2,000, they're going to rattle off all the checks in about 2 seconds. But sometimes lower rated players have to really look around and try to figure out exactly where all the checks are. So what I usually hear people say is, well, you could play bishop to g5 check, and you could play queen to h4 check, and I guess you could play queen to g5 check. And then I say, is there any more checks? And after a while, then they start to say, oh, yeah, there's a check over there on a3. And I say, any more? And then they go, well, there's the queen check on g7, but that's a silly move. He'll just take you with the bishop. And I say, well, okay, but that doesn't mean it's not a check. So again, they're filtering it out by saying that queen g7 is a bad move, so they're not going to list it. But I'm not asking what are all the safe checks or what are all the good checks. I just want to see how fast they can see what all the checks are. So it's like they're having trouble seeing queen to g7. It's interesting that this comes up because when I was in college, I took part in a psychological experiment where they were trying to figure out if people would be more hesitant to say words that would be banned. The kind of words you're not supposed to say on radio and television. So they would flash up people's words and see how fast people would say words. And their theory was that a lot of people would hesitate to say words that they're not supposed to say in polite society. I'm pretty sure I was not one of those people that hesitated, because even though I'm not someone who really curses, I'm not afraid to just read a word off a piece of paper if that's what they're saying. So I was probably saying all the words at the same speed. But their theory was that people would hesitate to say words that they're not supposed to normally say. And I'm sure for a lot of people that was true. I never saw the result of that psychological experiment, but that was the experiment that I took part of. And here it's almost exactly the same thing, where instead of queen takes g7 being a bad word or a dirty word, it's a dirty move, it's a bad move, and you filter it out and you don't want to say it. Queen takes g7, it doesn't work. So this is an example again of a filter, that queen takes g7 is just as much of a check as bishop g5 or queen h4 or queen g5. It certainly looks like it's much less of a safe move, but still it's a check, so you shouldn't filter it. Now I thought I would create a separate problem out of this problem where maybe queen takes g7 check wasn't such a bad move. So I think I did that. Let me see if I can find it real fast. Let me pause the video again. Okay, so after I fooled around for a while, I came up with this position, which is vaguely similar. All right, so if we ask what are all the checks again, we've got queen h4, we've got queen g5, we got bishop g5, we got queen takes g7. So this time we don't have queen a3 anymore, but the other 4 checks out of 5 are still there. All right, but if this is white to play, what's a good idea for white? Well, white has some interesting things he can do. I mean, black is ahead 3 knights here, but it turns out I purposely created this position out of the last one. Let's see if I could do it. That if you filter out queen takes g7 and you go, well, I can't do that because the knight will just take the queen, it turns out in this position, even though, yes, after queen takes g7, you lose the queen, it takes the knight away from the square where he can put the knights in the way, and now he only has 1 knight to put in the way on that square. And now when you play bishop checks and he puts the knight in the way, you've got checkmate. So if you play bishop g5 check right away to try to skewer the queen, he has a couple knights he can put in the way, and he's up 3 knights, so he can afford to lose one. And after he loses the knight, if you take it off with the pawn, let's say, and he takes it back with a knight, if you try to take with the bishop and then you check with the queen, he can come running up here. So it turns out, even though he's up 3 knights, if you filter out this, you're actually making a quiescence error, because not only is queen takes g7 a check in this position, it's actually a good move. unlike in the previous position where it's just as much a check, but it's not a good move. So here, queen checks. He can't put anything in the way. He can't run up to d6. His only legal move is to take the queen. And now you check, and now the two bishops are very powerful. We're not trying to win his queen here. We already sacked his queen. We're trying to checkmate him. He puts the knight in the way, and now we do not want to take with the pawn. If we take with the pawn, and he comes up, we can take the knight and hit the queen and, you know, win a bunch of material, but we don't want to win material. We want to checkmate him. So bishop takes f6 checkmate. So here, it's actually mate in 3 with queen takes g7. I don't know if that's the only mate. If I remember, white has maybe some other possibilities. But the point of this second puzzle here was that not only is queen g7 just as much of a check as the other ones, but it's actually a better check in this position. And if you filter it out and say queen takes g7, I'm not even going to look at it because it's not even a good move, turns out it's a very good move here. And I did this on purpose. As I said, I said, how could I change that other problem so that queen takes g7 is actually a really good move? And I came up with this one myself. Okay, so today we've talked about two very important concepts in chess. We've talked about filters and we've talked about masks. Masks, again, are something that prevent you from seeing something else. Like if you play too slow, you're going to be a terrible endgame player. But that doesn't mean you're terrible at the endgames. It just means you never have any time to play them. So the slowness is masking that out. Filters is just like what it says. You're filtering things out that maybe you shouldn't be filtering for some reason. When I used to work looking for submarines, we would use filters. We would try to filter out the wrong kind of noise from a system. We'd try to filter out information that was irrelevant to what we were looking for. For instance, when you have a stereo and you have a bass control and a treble control, you know, what you're doing when you change those is you're changing the frequency control so that it creates more of one particular octave and maybe less of another octave. So you're filtering out some of the regular sound information to emphasize other sound information. So when you turn the bass way up, then that's similar to turning all the other things way down. If you turn all the other things way down and leave the bass normal, then you're filtering out all those other frequencies and you hear that boom, boom, boom of a low frequency. That's what a filter does when you're talking about like a frequency filter, you know, fast Fourier transforms and all that kind of fun stuff that we used to work with when we programmed and looked for submarines. But in chess, it's basically the same kind of idea. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed today's video on filters and masks. Again, please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. We're trying to give you everything we can about getting better at chess and improving your game. If you liked the video, you can do a like. And of course, we're looking for 5,000 subscribers. We're getting close, so we could use your help. Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.